One of the things you learn in psychology class, one of the most concrete or useful, is conditioning. Conditioning. And there's two types. Conditioning. Um, and that's not like athletics when you run around a lot to condition yourself for the big game. It's we're in psychology. So conditioning is, I guess, controlling behavior is the simplest way to put it here. So there is classical conditioning, which was discovered first, and before I tell you the second one, I'm going to explain this a little bit. Classical conditioning is, well, it was discovered by, I don't know his first name. I think it was Igor, but his last name is definitely Pavlov. That's a famous name because of Pavlov's dogs. And this guy, this scientist, he wasn't even researching psychology. He was doing digestion, and he had a dog or a bunch of dogs. I'll attempt to draw some kind of dog face. Um, and he had these tubes attached to their mouths that would measure their saliva, and he would bring out food, and he would bring out his little bowl of food, and the dogs would start salivating, and he would measure how much based on how long it had been since they ate and what type of food they might like, and that's what his project was. But then he discovered that the dogs started salivating even before he brought the food out. And that was interesting to Mr. Pavlov. He wanted to know, did the dogs learn how to read the clock, or did they read his mind, or did they smell it before it was time? Did they hear the cabinet open? Um, being a scientist, he was curious about it. So what he did was every time before he brought the food out, he would ring his bell. And I don't know if it was actually shaped like this, but he would ring some type of bell, and the dogs would hear that, and then they would be presented with food, and then they would start salivating. So bell, then food, and then salivating. And they weren't salivating because of the bell at first. They were just drooling because they wanted the food. But eventually, after I don't know, a couple days, a couple weeks of this, he was able to cut out this step. He was able to ring the bell and have the dogs start drooling right away. I didn't switch to blue. He was able to shortcut the actual thing that made them salivate in the first place. So the diagrams that we use for this, I guess I'll go to purple again, is, let's see, the unconditioned stimulus. We use these little shorthand things. The unconditioned stimulus was the food, right? And the unconditioned response, UR, was the dog's drooling. Okay? So the unconditioned part just means that he didn't do it yet. He wasn't controlling the behavior. It's unconditioned. It's natural for the dogs to salivate when they see food. And after he performed these experiments, he had a conditioned response. And this is where the terms are a little funky. The conditioned response is also salivating. So it's a little misleading that these two are the same thing, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response, but that's the terms that we came up with. So what led us to that? The conditioned stimulus led to the conditioned response. And what's the conditioned stimulus? It's the bell. It's a banana peel or something. The bell. was what led us to that. And the way it did that was by means of the food, which I think is still called US. I think it's, sort of a 5-part diagram, but this makes more sense to me. This is how I visualize it. It's, the unconditioned stimulus is something that gives a reaction all by itself, naturally, no personal intervention, no person having to condition the dogs to do anything. Food automatically leads to drooling. And then after you perform the experiment, I guess this is this is before, okay? And this line is after the conditioning. And, the conditioned stimulus is the thing that he's been conditioned to react to. And that could be a bell in this case, or it could be the can opener that the dog hears, or the cabinet door that he sees, or he could see, I don't know, the look on your face that says, "I'm going to feed you now." Whatever this is, visual or auditory. So that's classical conditioning. That was the first one that was discovered by Pavlov. That's why it got the name classical, I think, is just it was the first one. And the other one is operant conditioning, which is a little bit more complicated. Operant conditioning sort of goes in the other direction. Rather than a stimulus and then the response and then they do it again, it's I guess I should just give an example. For operant conditioning, we could say we could put a mouse in a box. So there's our little mouse, and then he has a lever over here, or a button, something that he can interact with. He can step on it, he can poke it, or whatever. So they set it up. What I'm describing is called a Skinner box, which is any kind of thing where you have an animal in a very confined environment where you can monitor him and control everything about his environment is a Skinner box, and that's Skinner that came up with that. That's a name. So the mouse is in the box and he has a lever, and then every time the mouse wanders over to the lever and bumps into it, a pellet of food is dropped in. And then he can eat, and the mouse is happy. So, it's pretty obvious what the mouse is going to do. If the mouse has any brains at all, he's going to keep stepping on this and at least hope for food. It might not give it to him consistently, and I think I'll do another video about the different schedules of how often he might get reinforced. But this is the basic premise of it: is the mouse performs some action. It might be teaching your dog to do a trick. Every time he shakes hands with you, you give him a treat, and you're reinforcing it. It's reinforcement. This really isn't cooperating with me. But that's what the treat is called, the reinforcing stimulus, or positive reinforcement, because you give it to them. So these two things account for really a lot of behavior that we see in the wild. It's or any place. It's if a sound of a predator approaching targets you to run away or stimulates you to run in the other direction, then that's a good thing. That's a learned behavior. And if digging where you just saw a squirrel burying a nut gives you a nut, then you're going to do that again. And these operant conditioning and classical conditioning are really the two basic things that dictate the vast majority of behavior. There's not much else out there. So next video, I guess I'll talk to you more about operant conditioning.